Chapter 4 Airships.
どうしたの、チカ子様。これは何ですか？なんだよ。
The huge black thing leered down at her and seemed to raise its arm to strike.
Hey!
Shocked and drenched in sweat, Chikako sat bolt upright in her bunk, back aching, eyes wide, to see nothing more in the dimness than the slumbering form of Anya, her Russian cabin mate, covered in a mound of blankets. The tiny room was lit by a sort of half-light, and the sounds of music and singing were filtering in from somewhere out in the corridor. Nothing was amiss. Everything was normal. And comforting. Chikako fluffed up the sparse sheets and settled back into the uncomfortable bunk. She actually held a second-class ticket, but with every attempt to use the futon she had carried with her from Nagaoka City, leading to curious questions and whispers, followed by pointed chuckles, she had fled to the greater anonymity of a vacant bunk in third class. No matter. In the end, she had decided to keep it with her luggage and try and sleep in the Western way. Nightmares, backaches, and all. Chikako could never be sure who the threatening knobbed creature she feared in this terrible repetitive dream actually was. She was almost sure it was her grandfather, Yukichi. Yet the old man had only treated her with kindness and a dithering elderly affection. Had her overactive imagination reached back into the old man's fierce samurai past, when he had served as one of the lesser daimyos of what would become Tokyo, in the days when the shogun still held power? She did not know. To her, Oji-san, last of the Fukuzawa line, gone a decade now, had always been a frail, kindly old man. She found it hard to think of him in his fiery youth 60 years ago, before Perry came in 1853 with his smoking black ships to open Japan to trade. Chikako settled back in her bunk to calm down and drink in the strangeness of her present reality. She had booked passage to New York aboard Titanic on the advice, and with the financial assistance, of the Count's chief engineer, Dr. Ludwig Dürr, back in Friedrichshafen. It was Dürr who thought she would do well to study some of the principles researched by Dr. Bell and his aerodrome crew in Halifax. And as he had noted in his almost flawless Oxford English, their recent work in dynamic lift principles may reliably be applied to airship design. Carrying a letter of introduction to Dr. Bell, whom Dürr had met at a scientific conference in New York some years before, Chikako planned to spend an intense 3 weeks in the experiment station in Nova Scotia. She planned on returning to Germany on board the Kaiserin Victoria in early June. At 24 and a half, Chikako Wada, a mere wisp of a girl, at 4 feet 11 inches and 93 pounds, with the fair skin and jet black hair of a traditional Japanese beauty, was in point of fact a stunning anomaly. The first female graduate in physics at Keio University in Tokyo, she had immediately become one of its most popular and sought-after instructors. She had excelled in every subject on the curriculum, except English, and that was unfortunate, because English was something she needed badly right now. In the 3 days at sea, since they had left Queenston, Chikako, or Sheila Migarlo, as the loud red-faced Irishwoman in the next cabin called her, had taken whatever opportunity was available to practice that difficult and illogical language on casual acquaintances. Since so many third-class passengers were immigrants from a multitude of different countries, her unusual appearance and peculiar accent put no one off for very long. And indeed, she once had to tell an amorous and heavy-breathing Yorkshireman to "Please go, take the air, 23," daring her use of English slang. But it had worked, and whether overcome by alcohol or the crushing sadness of this rejection, it was impossible to tell. The big blonde had fallen heavily into a chair, and within a few moments incipient romantic passion had been replaced by unconsciousness, and then by deep sonorous snoring. Like so many things she had attempted against the odds, Chikako had again done well. As a child, her father had taken her to watch the remarkable flight of the huge kites on the seashore near Aichio. This experience had done something to her she had never quite gotten over. Years later, when she was 17 and the Asahi Shimbun reported demonstration flights made by Alberto Santos Dumont in France, Chikako was filled with an unquenchable and undying passion to fly. Something which, for a teenage girl in Meiji, Japan, was nothing short of impractical and absolutely out of reach daydream. It was true that the nightmares had begun at about the same time, but then they were not as fierce. The admonitions to strive and achieve had seemed more gentle and tolerant in her youth. The dream had only become a nightmare recently. On this particular Sunday night, April 14th, she had turned in quite early, physically exhausted by the intensity with which she had attacked Owen W. Wright's few papers on aerodynamics all day. Packed carefully with her small amount of luggage, scientific reprints with titles like Abhandlung von der Aerodynamisches Institut and Theoretical Basis of Maximum Lift Coefficient abounded. Since there were, as yet, few aircraft of any kind to speak of in 1912 Japan, Chikako had searched far afield in pursuit of her dream, sending off her impressive credentials along with testimonials from academic colleagues. Her designs for a warpable elevator had been mailed to every aviation pioneer and experimenter she had ever read about in a library of newspapers. Still, despite an additional punctuation, the ambitious girl would work for almost nothing. Her enthusiasm had been answered by months of silence. Not so much as even a polite rejection had crossed the threshold of the small Tokyo flat. After nearly a half year of effort, the diminutive girl was just beginning to accept what the rest of her life as a university professor would probably look like. When that peculiar envelope with the odd Bavarian postmark arrived. Bodensee, it had said, and the stamp bore the image of the King of Bavaria. Forgetting for a moment that the idea of a king in a vest pocket-sized German municipality seemed the height of absurdity, Chikako let out an involuntary high-pitched squeak when she noticed the return address. Reichmann Graf Ferdinand von Zeppelin, Postfach 12, and the logo of DELAG. She knew from her university German that the acronym stood for Deutsche Luftschiff Aktiengesellschaft, the airship company of Germany. Deciding that sleep was not going to come easily again, if at all, the hooting and pipe playing down the hall was growing louder rather than softer as the minutes ticked by. Chikako rose, dressed quietly, murmured, "All right, I go up," and decided to take a stroll deckside. It was only about 10:30 p.m. anyway. The 4 days she'd been aboard since Cherbourg had been fairly uneventful. Watching the wealthy in their daily parade on the upper decks was a bore, as she told Anya. She could not understand why so many of the steerage passengers needed to put themselves through the self-defeating spectacle of watching others whose material wealth they could never hope to come near. Were they living vicariously through these people? She was left flat by human psychology. For a serious and technical-minded girl like Chikako, the real thrill was the gadgetry this vessel carried. She knew that the ship had a wireless telephone room, which was in almost continuous operation. And that particularly nice crewman, "Just call me Fleddy," she repeated with delight, had given her a handwritten pass addressed to Jack Phillips of the Marconi Company, allowing a few minutes' visit. On impulse, Chikako decided to use the pass tonight.